It was a chilly evening when Mrs. Thompson, the owner of a small grocery store, noticed a young girl slipping a loaf of bread and a few apples into her worn-out backpack. The girl looked around nervously before rushing out of the store without paying. Mrs. Thompson's first instinct was to call the police, but something about the girl's frail appearance and anxious eyes stopped her. Instead, she decided to follow her. The girl walked quickly, glancing over her shoulder as if afraid of being caught. After a few blocks, Mrs. Thompson saw her turn into a narrow alleyway and enter an old, run-down building. The windows were cracked, and the door barely hung on its hinges. She hesitated before stepping inside. What she saw next took her breath away. In the dimly lit room, a small boy, no older than 5, sat on a thin mattress, shivering. His eyes lit up when he saw the girl. "Did you get something to eat, Maya?" he asked eagerly. The girl, Maya, nodded and pulled out the bread and apples. "I did, Toby. We can eat tonight," she said, her voice filled with relief. Mrs. Thompson's heart clenched. This girl hadn't stolen out of greed. She had done it out of desperation to feed her little brother. Guilt washed over her for assuming the worst. Stepping forward, she cleared her throat. Maya gasped and shielded Toby instinctively, but Mrs. Thompson raised her hands in peace. "I'm not here to hurt you," she said gently. "Why didn't you ask for help?" Maya's eyes filled with tears. "We've been on our own for weeks. I try, but no one listens." Mrs. Thompson felt a lump in her throat. "You don't have to steal, sweetheart. Come with me. I'll make sure you both have food and a safe place to stay." Maya hesitated before nodding, realizing that, for the first time in a long while, someone truly cared. Mrs. Thompson led Maya and Toby back to her store, her mind racing with thoughts. How had these two children been left alone like this? Where were their parents? But she knew those questions could wait. Right now, they needed warmth, food, and kindness. When they reached the store, she locked the door behind them and guided them to a small table in the back. She handed Maya a warm blanket and wrapped another around Toby, who was already starting to relax in the cozy space. "You too must be starving," she said softly, heading to the kitchen. In a few minutes, she returned with bowls of hot soup, bread, and a little cup of cocoa for Toby. Maya hesitated, her pride holding her back, but Toby didn't wait. He grabbed a spoon and began eating eagerly. As Maya finally took a bite, Mrs. Thompson sat down across from them. "Tell me, sweetheart, where are your parents?" Maya swallowed hard and lowered her gaze. "Our mom passed away last year. Our dad, he left a long time ago. We were staying with a neighbor, but she couldn't afford to keep us anymore. So we've been living in that old building for the past few weeks." Mrs. Thompson's eyes welled up. No child should have to go through this. She reached for Maya's hand. "You don't have to live like that anymore. I know some people who can help. Good people, but until then you can stay here." Maya's lips quivered. "Why would you help us?" "I stole from you." Mrs. Thompson smiled warmly. "Because sometimes people don't steal out of greed. They steal out of need. And when that happens, what they really need isn't punishment, it's kindness." For the first time in a long while, Maya felt something she had almost forgotten. Hope. That night, for the first time in weeks, Maya and Toby slept in warm beds. Mrs. Thompson had set up a small cot for Toby in the back room of the store and gave Maya a cozy spot on the couch in her living room upstairs. She had even found some clean clothes for them, leftovers from when her own children were younger. The next morning, the smell of fresh pancakes woke Maya up. She blinked, momentarily confused, before remembering where she was. She sat up and saw Toby curled up under a thick blanket, snoring softly. She quietly walked downstairs and found Mrs. Thompson flipping pancakes in the kitchen. "Good morning, sweetheart," the woman greeted warmly. "I thought you too could use a good breakfast." Maya hesitated before sitting at the table. "Mrs. Thompson, you don't have to do all this for us." The older woman chuckled. "Oh, honey, kindness isn't a burden. It's a choice, and I choose to help you." Maya's throat tightened. She had spent so long believing that the world was cruel and that she and Toby were completely alone. Yet here was someone who owed her nothing, treating them with love and care. As they ate, Mrs. Thompson spoke gently. I made a few calls this morning. There's a local shelter that helps children in situations like yours. They can provide a safe place to stay, food, and even help you get back into school. Maya's grip tightened around her fork. But what if they separate us? They won't, Mrs. Thompson assured her. I made sure of that. They'll keep you and Toby together. And until we get everything sorted out, you both can stay here with me. Maya looked down at her plate, fighting back tears. She had spent so long trying to be strong, trying to survive. But now, for the first time in forever, she felt like she didn't have to do it alone. Thank you, she whispered. Mrs. Thompson reached across the table and squeezed her hand. You're welcome, sweetheart. Now eat up. You and Toby have a whole new future waiting for you. And for the first time in a long while, Maya believed it. You said, the days that followed felt like a dream to Maya and Toby. For the first time in months, they didn't have to worry about where their next meal would come from or whether they would have a safe place to sleep. Mrs. Thompson treated them with the same kindness and care she would her own grandchildren, and slowly, Maya began to let her guard down. One afternoon, as Maya helped restock shelves in the store, a social worker named Mrs. Reynolds arrived. She was a kind woman with soft brown eyes and a warm smile. Hello, Maya, she greeted gently. Mrs. Thompson told me a little about your situation, and I'd love to talk with you. Maya stiffened, fear creeping back in. What if they took Toby away from her? What if they sent him somewhere worse? Sensing her hesitation, Mrs. Thompson gave her a reassuring pat on the back. It's okay, sweetheart. She just wants to help. Taking a deep breath, Maya followed Mrs. Reynolds to a small table in the store's back room. I know this must be scary, the woman said softly. But I want you to know that our goal is to keep you and Toby together and make sure you both have a safe, stable home. Maya studied her carefully, searching for any hint of dishonesty. What kind of home? She asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Mrs. Reynolds smiled. There's a wonderful foster family in town that has experience taking in siblings. They have a little girl around Toby's age and a big backyard where you can play. They're kind people, just like Mrs. Thompson. Maya's heart pounded. It sounded too good to be true. And if we don't like it, she asked hesitantly, then we'll find another way, Mrs. Reynolds assured her. You won't be forced into anything you're uncomfortable with. But I promise, you and Toby won't ever have to live on the streets again. For the first time, Maya allowed herself to believe that maybe, just maybe, things could get better. That evening, she sat with Mrs. Thompson on the porch, watching Toby play with a small toy truck the older woman had given him. Do you think this family will really be good to us? Maya asked, her voice laced with doubt. Mrs. Thompson smiled. I do. And if they're not, you always have a place here with me. Maya blinked back tears. I don't know how to thank you. You don't have to, Mrs. Thompson said, pulling her into a gentle hug. Just promise me one thing. When you grow up, if you ever see someone struggling the way you did, pass the kindness on. Maya nodded, a determined spark in her eyes. I will. A week later, Maya and Toby moved in with their new foster family. It wasn't easy at first, trusting again, learning to feel safe, but they slowly began to heal. Mrs. Thompson remained in their lives, visiting often, always reminding them that they were loved. Years later, Maya, now a young woman, walked into a small grocery store, not as a frightened child stealing food, but as a volunteer bringing meals to those in need. Years passed, and Maya grew into a strong, determined young woman. She and Toby stayed with their foster family, the Parkers, who treated them with kindness and patience. At first, Maya was hesitant to trust them, but over time, she realized they truly cared. They enrolled her in school, helped Toby adjust, and never made them feel like a burden. Despite their new home, Maya never forgot Mrs. Thompson. She visited the store whenever she could, helping out on weekends and holidays. Mrs. Thompson, now in her 70s, still ran the store with the same warmth and generosity. You've grown into such a fine young lady, she would often say, beaming with pride. Maya worked hard in school, determined to make something of herself. She knew firsthand what it felt like to struggle, to be hungry, to feel alone. She wanted to make sure no other child had to endure what she and Toby had. After graduating high school, she applied for a scholarship to study social work, inspired by Mrs. Reynolds, the kind social worker who had helped her. When she received her acceptance letter, she rushed the store, her heart pounding with excitement. "Mrs. Thompson," she called as she pushed open the door. The elderly woman turned, her eyes lighting up. "Well, look at you. What's got you so excited, dear?" Maya handed her the letter, barely able to contain her joy. "I got into college. I'm going to study social work." Tears filled Mrs. Thompson's eyes as she pulled Maya into a hug. "Oh, sweetheart, I am so proud of you. I always knew you were meant for great things." Maya worked tirelessly through college, balancing her studies with part-time jobs and volunteer work. She spent weekends at shelters, helping homeless children and families, just as Mrs. Thompson had once helped her. She even started a program at her university to provide free meals to struggling students. Meanwhile, Toby flourished as well. He loved science and dreamed of becoming an engineer. Maya often found him tinkering with old electronics, determined to figure out how they worked. The Parkers encouraged his curiosity, enrolling him in summer programs and supporting his passion. One day, during Maya's final year of college, she received a phone call that made her heart sink. Mrs. Thompson had fallen ill. Without hesitation, Maya rushed back to town, making her way to the hospital where the older woman lay resting. "Mrs. Thompson," she whispered, taking the woman's frail hand in hers. The elderly woman opened her eyes and smiled weakly. "My dear Maya, you came." "Of course I did," Maya said, fighting back tears. "Your family." Mrs. Thompson gave a small chuckle. "I always knew you would do wonderful things. You have such a big heart." Maya swallowed the lump in her throat. "Everything I've done is because of you. You taught me kindness when I had nothing. You gave me hope." Mrs. Thompson squeezed her hand gently. "Then my job here is done." A few days later, Mrs. Thompson passed away peacefully in her sleep. The entire town mourned her loss. At her funeral, people from all walks of life came forward, sharing stories of how she had helped them, giving food to the hungry, offering jobs to those in need, and simply being a source of comfort. Maya stood before the crowd, tears streaming down her face. Mrs. Thompson wasn't just a store owner, she said, her voice trembling. She was a light in the darkness. She saw people when no one else did. And because of her, I am who I am today. I promised to carry her kindness forward. True to her word, Maya continued her mission. She graduated college and founded a nonprofit organization dedicated to helping homeless youth, ensuring they had food, shelter, and education. She named it Thompson's Hope in honor of the woman who had changed her life. Years later, standing outside a newly opened shelter under the organization's name, Maya watched as a little girl hesitantly stepped forward, clutching her younger brother's hand. The sight was all too familiar. Maya knelt down and smiled warmly. "Are you hungry, sweetheart?" The girl nodded timidly. "Come on in," Maya said gently, leading them inside. "You're safe here." And just like that, the cycle of kindness continued as the years went by. Thompson's hope grew into something Maya had never imagined. What had started as a small initiative in honor of Mrs. Thompson expanded into multiple shelters across the state, helping thousands of homeless children find food, education, and security. Maya worked tirelessly, ensuring that no child ever had to endure the struggles she and Toby once faced. Meanwhile, Toby flourished as well. He earned a scholarship to study engineering, and later started his own company focused on developing affordable technology for underprivileged communities. Despite his success, he remained deeply connected to Thompson's Hope, often volunteering his time to help at the shelters and mentoring kids who shared a story similar to his own. One evening, as Maya locked up the shelter for the night, she heard a soft knock on the door. She opened it to find a teenage girl, no older than 16, standing in the cold with a younger boy beside her. Their clothes were tattered, their eyes filled with fear and exhaustion. Maya's heart clenched. It was like looking into a mirror of her past. "Hey there," she said gently. "Are you two okay?" The girl hesitated, gripping her brother's hand tightly. We don't have anywhere to go," she admitted. Maya smiled warmly. Well, you do now. Come inside, we'll get you something to eat. The girl hesitated for only a moment before stepping in. Maya led them to the dining area, where volunteers were preparing warm meals for the night's guests. As she handed them plates of food, she couldn't help but think of the night she had stolen that loaf of bread, the night that had changed everything. Later, as the girl and her brother sat eating quietly, Maya knelt beside them. What are your names? The girl looked up cautiously. Lena, and this is my little brother, Jake. Maya nodded. Lena, Jake, I want you to know that you're safe here. You don't have to worry anymore. We'll make sure you have food, a warm bed, and people who care about you. Lena's eyes filled with tears. Why are you helping us? Maya smiled, the words coming naturally. Because a long time ago, someone helped me when I thought I had no one, and she taught me that kindness can change a life. Lena wiped her eyes, nodding slowly. For the first time in a long while, she let herself believe that maybe things could get better. As Maya walked back to her office that night, she looked up at the framed photograph of Mrs. Thompson hanging on the wall. You did it, she thought, smiling. Your kindness lives on. And so, the cycle of hope continued, one life at a time. Years passed, and Thompson's hope became more than just a shelter. It became a movement. Maya and Toby dedicated their lives to expanding its reach, ensuring that no child had experienced the fear, hunger, and loneliness they once knew. As Maya grew older, she saw the impact of their work firsthand. Many of the children who had once arrived at the shelters, frightened and lost, grew into strong, capable adults. Some became social workers, teachers, and even volunteers at Thompson's Hope, carrying forward the same kindness that had saved them. One day, as Maya prepared for a fundraising gala, an annual event that helped fund new shelters, she received a letter that made her pause. It was from Lena, the young girl she had helped years ago. Dear Maya, it's been a long time, but I wanted to thank you again. That night when Jake and I walked into your shelter, I thought it was the end for us. I was ready to give up, but you saw us. You gave us food, warmth, and most importantly, hope. Because of you, I finished school. I'm now studying to become a social worker, so I can help kids like me. Jake is doing great, too. He's in college now, studying computer science. We owe everything to you and Thompson's Hope. I just wanted you to know that your kindness saved us. And one day, I hope to do the same for someone else. With gratitude, Lena. Maya wiped away a tear, her heart swelling with pride. It was proof that Mrs. Thompson's legacy lived on, not just through her, but through every child who had been given a second chance. That evening at the gala, Maya stood before a packed room of supporters, donors, and volunteers. She held Lena's letter in her hands, her voice filled with emotion. This is why we do what we do, she said, because kindness has a ripple effect. It starts with one act, one moment of compassion, and it spreads. Years ago, I was just a scared girl stealing food to survive. But someone saw me, believed in me, and gave me a chance. Now, we have given that same chance to thousands of children, and they, in turn, will pass it on. The room erupted in applause, but Maya's thoughts drifted to one person, the woman who had started it all. After the event, she visited the old grocery store, now turned into Thompson's Hope headquarters. A plaque hung outside, dedicated to Mrs. Thompson. Maya traced the engraved words with her fingers. In loving memory of Margaret Thompson, a woman who proved that one act of kindness can change the world. As the night breathed